Nigeria is also the largest market.
The global order is changing, and one continent is at the center of it all.
China has over the years grown to become Africa's biggest trade partner.
Since the year 2000, China has been making secret deals in Africa in its bid to build an empire that could destabilize the established order on the international stage. From pledging $60 billion in economic assistance for African countries in 2018 and another $40 billion in 2021, China is now Africa's biggest trading partner with a trade agreement of over $200 billion per year. The Asian giant also agreed to increase its import from Africa to a total of $300 billion. In this spirit of partnership, over 10,000 Chinese firms have called Africa home over the last 2 decades. Chinese businesses in Africa are said to be valued at over $2 trillion, with more investments pouring in every day. In fact, China now has more construction projects ongoing in Africa than it has in the entire Asian continent. According to this database that shows all the Chinese loans to Africa since the year 2000, more than 1,000 Chinese financiers have signed loan commitments worth $160 billion with African governments and their state-owned enterprises in the last 20 years. The deals include billions of dollars for transportation, power generation, mining, and telecommunications. We have spent the last few months tracking the projects tied to these loans in countries including Angola, Zambia, Ethiopia, Kenya, Nigeria, Cameroon, Sudan, and Ghana. While some of the projects were indeed carried out, albeit by Chinese companies, most were riddled with corruption and embezzlement of funds for political campaigns and luxurious lifestyles for the political class in these African countries. Now, I want to show you how these deals were made, what investments were given to these countries by China, and what was the cost of those investments. As we dive deep into the dark sides of these deals, we will review some terms of the agreements and why they are concerning for the future of Africa. Buckle up, it's surely going to be a wild ride, this one.
China supports the settlement of African issues by Africans in the African way.
It began in the early 1950s. Shortly after establishing the People's Republic of China in 1949, the Chinese Communist leader Mao Zedong started making efforts to build alliances with his neighbors. His primary targets were the newly independent nations in Asia. However, he was also interested in getting close to the newly formed countries in Africa and Latin America. The goal for Chairman Mao was for China to be a leader of the developing world. He wanted to provide an alternative to Western and Soviet influence. But rivaling the world powers wasn't the only drive here. China's decision to engage these developing countries were driven by its need for resources, markets, and diplomatic influence. Now, this last point will be very important to our story shortly. At the time, Mao Zedong referred to third world countries as, quote, a land of opportunity. And now, just a little side note here, China was part of these third world countries during this time. Oh yeah, the China we see today is quite different from Mao's China. But if the China of today is different, then why am I telling you about Mao Zedong? Well, in 1955, Chairman Mao Zedong, along with others, organized one of the most important conferences between Africa and Asia. It was the Bandung Conference in Indonesia.
At the Asian-African Conference, 29 nations, with a population of more than 1,400,000,000 persons, attend the historic conference in Indonesia's capital city of Bandung.
The first large-scale Asian-African conference to promote Afro-Asian economic and cultural cooperation. The leaders also wanted to use this alliance to oppose colonialism or neocolonialism by any nation. Remember, this was 1955 and the British and French were still holding on to some colonial possessions. So this conference was a vital one for all concerned parties. According to reports, 29 countries representing a total population of 1.5 billion people, which was 54% of the world's population at the time, were said to have participated in this conference. China used this platform to promote solidarity among newly independent nations. The Asian giants also provided economic and military aid to several African countries, supporting liberation movements across the continent. China leveraged the relationship with these third world countries to call for an international united front against the established superpowers, that is, the United States and Soviet Union at the time. By 1971, the investment paid off for the Communist Party of China, as the support of these third world nations was crucial in the People's Republic of China joining the United Nations, against the wishes of the United States, I must say. Since then, Chinese influence in Africa has not only multiplied to almost all countries on the continent, it has led to the formation of a new alliance that is threatening to destroy a global order that has kept third world countries poor. But how exactly did China build this alliance? Let me tell you about China's blueprint in third world countries. Africa was recently dubbed the fastest urbanizing region of the world, with the largest number of developing countries. This rapid developmental drive on the continent of Africa presents huge opportunities for countries willing to risk billions of dollars in infrastructure building. This is where China comes in. Remember how China used to be a third world country along with Africa back in the 1950s and 60s? Well, not anymore. The Asian giants have used infrastructure to propel economic growth in the last 2 decades. While Mao's China faced an unprecedented, difficult period that saw an estimated 45 million people die from starvation during something called the Great Leap Forward, all that is behind them now. China now has a high-speed rail network, has constructed over 100 new airports and built thousands of new urban areas in mainland China. All these investments propel China's economy to number 2 in the world, behind only the United States. So, when you consider the fact that Africa currently has the largest number of developing countries, you then begin to understand why many African leaders are looking to China to bring this much needed experience to their countries. Our first case study here will be Nigeria.
Nigeria is also the largest market for the Chinese project contractor and the second largest market for Chinese export.
There were no serious diplomatic relations between Nigeria and China before the Civil War of 1967. That was until February 1971, when the two nations grew closer as a result of the events of 1970s to 1998, where China faced international isolation while Nigeria suffered Western condemnation because of its military regimes. Anyways, Nigeria now ranks high among China's top 40 trading partners globally and China's most significant investment destination in Africa. Nigeria is also an important source of oil and petroleum for China's rapidly growing economy. In return, China provides extensive economic, military, and political support to various Nigerian leaders. It's kind of like a scratch my back, I scratch yours kind of situation. Like in January 2017, when the Nigerian government ordered Taiwan to move its unofficial embassy out of Abuja, arguing that the African country was a defender of the One China vision. This order only came after Nigeria obtained a $40 billion investment pledge from China. Yeah, nothing to see here. Loyalty in international politics is always for sale. But what are these Chinese investments in Nigeria? Between 2000 to 2011, there were approximately 40 official development projects linked to Chinese funds in Nigeria. These projects ranged from a $2.5 billion loan for Nigerian rail, power, or telecommunications projects to a memorandum of understanding for $1 billion for the construction of houses and water supply in Abuja in 2009 and several other rail networks. Nigeria is now one of about 150 countries in the world to benefit from China's Belt and Road Initiative program, which has been described as the brainchild of Chinese leader Xi Jinping in his bid to enhance global trade connectivity. From this, China has become Nigeria's preferred partner in terms of development assistance. And here is where things get interesting. As you will see from all the other case studies to come, the company responsible for most of this construction has been the state-owned China Civil Engineering Construction Corporation, which has been around in Nigeria for some 43 years. This Chinese company has been involved in the construction of rail lines, airport terminals, and other mega projects. Many of these projects are financed through concession loans from China's Export-Import Bank. Some of these projects include Abuja-Kaduna Railway for $876 million, $500 million of which is loans from the Export-Import Bank of China. There's also the $6.68 billion Lagos-Kano Standard Gauge Railway. The project was awarded to the same company. China's financial involvement in Nigeria is substantial, but the reason for this is quite simple. Unlike the West, Chinese loans to Nigeria are often concessional, with favorable terms. These loans are primarily directed towards infrastructure and developmental projects. In recent years, Nigeria's debt to China stands at several billions of dollars, with major loans funding the country's critical infrastructure. So the question here is, are these loans and businesses with China really that bad for Nigeria? Or is this some Western media propaganda to scuttle the relationship between both countries? In exchange for financing and building the infrastructure that poorer countries need, China often demands favorable access to their natural resources. If you fail to pay back what you owe, they can lay claim to your assets for a certain number of years. Financing projects abroad also allows China to boost its exports of goods and services. Most of China's financing is in the form of commercial loans which are tied to projects. So, if your country gets a Chinese loan, for example, China will not give you any money. Rather, they will send in their construction companies to come and execute the project which the loan is meant for. This is like carrying the money they promised to give to you as loan, giving it to their company, and telling the company to come and build the infrastructure for your country. These whole monies are repatriated back to mainland China. So, loans from China gives you, the borrower, a giant pile of debt, while they get contracts from you that help to boost their export of goods and services. However, the most concerning dark sides of these deals have to do with the corruption it fuels. In May 2020, Nigeria's House of Representatives decided unanimously to probe Chinese loans. Despite pleas from the Minister of Transportation, Rotimi Amaechi, that the inquiry might frustrate future Chinese loans, the lawmakers were hell-bent on unveiling what some saw as opaque and secretive infrastructure loans. However, by late June 2021, there were media reports that the House probe had been suspended. China responded to the House probe by saying that loans to Nigeria were mutually beneficial. Multiple reports have revealed that Chinese firms in Nigeria engage in corruption to carry out their businesses. In April 2020, the African Development Bank, ADB, blacklisted China Zhangao Nigeria Limited, a civil engineering company registered in Nigeria, from conducting business with the bank for 18 months. The Chinese company and their local associates had engaged in fraudulent practices while bidding for an ADB-financed project in Nigeria. A year later, on July 30th, 2021, two Chinese companies operating in Nigeria were debarred and made ineligible to participate in World Bank-financed contracts for breaching the guidelines relating to fraud and corruption. The two companies are China Railway Construction International Nigeria Limited, which won a deal of $10 billion to construct a railway along the coast of Nigeria, And the other one is the China National Electric Engineering Company Nigeria Limited, which is handling the construction of the 700 megawatt hydroelectric Zungeru project, one of Africa's biggest hydropower plants located in Niger State. This project is to cost $1.3 billion. And there is the bribery offenses. On May 11, 2020, the Economic and Financial Crimes Commission arrested 2 Chinese staff of China Zhangao Nigeria Limited in Sokoto, northwestern Nigeria. Kun and Koi had allegedly offered a bribe of 50 million naira, that is about $100,000 at the time, to local EFCC agents in order to compromise ongoing investigations into this Chinese company. The company was being investigated for fraud valued at over 50 billion naira, approximately $100 million at the time. On February 6, 2021, a Premium Times investigation revealed the allegation of money laundering involving Stella Odua, a former minister of the Federal Republic of Nigeria, and the China Civil Engineering Construction Corporation Nigeria Limited in 2014. The amount was said to be about 5 billion naira, that is $10 million at the time. In another instance of Chinese companies trying to get ahead, Rotimi Amechi, Nigeria's former transportation minister, announced sometime in 2020 that the China Civil Engineering Construction Corporation will be building a $50 million transport university in Daura. According to Amechi, this was a gift from this company. The only challenge with this gift is that Daura in northwestern Katsina State is the hometown of former President Muhammadu Buhari, who was the sitting president at the time this gift was given. But this is not just a Nigerian affair. A similar story is playing out in Angola. The Republic of Angola is a country in Central Africa that is often described as the world's richest poor country. It is endowed with massive petroleum and diamond deposits, and yet 52% of its population lives in abject poverty. After struggling for over a decade, Angola gained independence from Portugal in 1975. This was before sliding into a long civil war that lasted for 27 years until 2002. This war destroyed almost all of Angola's infrastructure. Since the end of the war, Angola has focused on post-war reconstruction and has struggled to develop its economy, which, by the way, is largely dependent on oil. The country joined the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries in 2007, and since 2008, Angola has been at the top of oil producers in Africa. This is where China comes in. Oil is said to be at the center of the Sino-Angolan relationship. Major aspects of relations between the two countries are China's loans in exchange for oil, as well as involvement in Angolan infrastructure. At one point, Angola became the second largest source of Chinese oil imports after Saudi Arabia, a deal that saw China fund the country's developmental goals. Now, let me show you some of these Chinese investments in Angola. In 2002, the government of Angola was ready to rebuild the country after a 27-year civil war. The IMF offered loans to fund a large-scale infrastructure reconstruction program, albeit insisting that Angola had to play by its rules. Well, the Angolan government did not agree with the conditions of the IMF and instead decided to negotiate with China. At the time, China's economy demanded more and more natural resources, especially oil, as its manufacturing industries were on the rise. The commencement of war in the Middle East during this time made it necessary for China to diversify its imports. And here comes Angola to the rescue. In 2004, China's Export-Import Bank offered the first loan to Angola, and both countries were able to secure their national interest. China agreed to provide infrastructure investment in return for oil, leading to a massive rise in Chinese investments in the region. By 2013, there were around 172,000 Chinese living in Angola, working on infrastructure projects. The China International Trust and Investment Corporation was one of the first Chinese companies to invest in Angola, with a $350 million investment in the country's oil sector. Angola quickly became the poster child for Chinese engagements in the African continent. Although the exact volume of Chinese loans to Angola is not known, estimates show that between 2000 to 2018, Angola was at the top of recipients of Chinese infrastructure loans, with about $43 billion worth of loan commitments. In 2021, Angola was the most indebted country to China of any African state. In the same year, 72% of all Angola's oil exports went to China. The agreement between both countries allowed for Chinese investments to be recovered from extracted and imported petroleum. But what concessions are Angolans making? Aside from oil, of course.
The Kakulu-Kabaka hydropower station is expected to drastically ease power shortage in Angola. It has a total contractual value of more than $4 billion.
According to Chinese credit lines to Angola, 70% of the public tenders for the contracts under Angolan reconstruction would be awarded to Chinese companies. Angola had an effective local content policy known as the Angolanization, which was in place since 1957. Under this policy, all companies registered with the Angolan National Agency for Private Investment needed to achieve 70% local employment. However, these regulations were systematically subverted to favor Chinese companies. China's relationship with Angola has come under fire more frequently than many other African countries in the Belt and Road Initiative. A key reason for this controversy is the type of agreement China entered into with the government of Angola in 2004. This agreement is known as Resources for Infrastructure, RFI. This is simply the exchange of Chinese infrastructure for African natural resources. This drew international criticism of neocolonialism. But that is not even the dark sides of the Angolan business deals with China. We will have to look at the corruption involved for that one.
Dos cofres da petrolífera Sonangol.
This is not simply a story about Angola.
Isabel's fortune is increasingly coming under scrutiny.
In February 2010, some allegations of corruption came in relation to Chinese investments in Angola linked to the China Investment Fund, a private entity with close ties to the Chinese and Angolan governments. President João Lourenço, who came into office in September 2017, vowed to fight corruption by bringing all looting of state coffers to a halt. His quest yielded results when it was announced that over $11 billion of looted funds that were stashed in Britain, Switzerland, Singapore, and Bermuda had all been recovered. The president launched an anti-corruption drive to recoup assets he suspected were embezzled under his predecessor, that is former President Jose Eduardo dos Santos' administration. In 2020, Jose Filomeno dos Santos, the son of the former president, became the first member of the former first family to be prosecuted as part of an anti-corruption campaign led by President João Lourenço. Bela dos Santos, named as Africa's richest woman at the time, and who is the daughter of the former president, was also named by International Consortium of Investigative Journalists in their report Luanda Leaks for allegedly growing her business empire by corrupt means. But what really happened in Angola at this period? What was the corruption? Well, it started when the bank account of Angola's state-owned oil company, Sonangol, was drained in a matter of hours on November 16, 2017. It was reported that the account, which contained $57 million at the start of the day, was left with a balance of only $309 when the day was over. That same day, the head of the company, which happened to be Isabela dos Santos, the daughter of Angola's former president, was reportedly fired. The money that was so rapidly transferred from Sonangol's coffers did not, however, go directly into dos Santos' pockets. Instead, it went to a consulting company run by one of our close allies. This was reportedly one of the many attacks on the country's treasury by this woman.
My parents formed who I am as a person. But my professional choices and the risks I have taken and the businesses I have built and created were done by my own vision.
According to President João Lourenço of Angola, the scale of the looting under former President Dos Santos amounted to at least $24 billion. But one of the most notorious scandals of Mr. Dos Santos' rule is said to be an alliance between allies of the former president and a secretive Hong Kong group known as 88 Queensway that allegedly wiped out Sonangol, that is the Angola's oil company. Well, nothing to see here is Africa and always corruption. Let's move on to Kenya.
A new report says that Kenya's government data is under attack. Chinese hackers are trying to gather government secrets.
Talking about our bilateral relations, it's about optics sometimes, reality versus myths.
Kenya is the fourth largest economy in sub-Saharan Africa. The leading sectors that drive the Kenyan economy include agriculture, services that include real estate, finance, and manufacturing. Although Kenya is a relatively resource-poor country, that changed when natural resources such as oil, natural gas, coal, niobium, and rare earth metals were discovered. As usual, this discovery led to a competition between firms from Western countries such as the United States, the UK, Germany, and Canada, and firms from emerging economies such as China, India, and Brazil. China is currently Kenya's largest trading partner. While the robust trade, investment, and Chinese-led infrastructure projects have benefited Kenya's overall development and have been labeled by both governments as a win-win collaborations, local media and foreign analysts have increasingly criticized both the potential consequences of Kenya's loan from China as well as Kenya's overall economic dependence on foreign capital and products. The most ambitious collaboration, which is the standard gauge rail, that was planned to connect Nairobi, Uganda, South Sudan, and Rwanda using Chinese financing and contractors, has attracted even more controversies due to financial complications. There are also questions on the legality of its tender process and the alleged collateralization of Kenya's Mombasa port. Between 2000 to 2011, there were approximately 65 Chinese official development finance projects identified in Kenya. These projects range from $108 million grants from Chinese governments to build the Northeast Ring Road section in Nairobi to concessional loans to finance the construction of the Kenyatta University Teaching, Research and Referral Hospital project in 2011. Kenya has been receiving Chinese support for multiple road infrastructure projects since 2006. But what do these loans mean for Kenya's economy? Kenya owes more than $6 billion to China, its largest creditor. The bulk of that debt financed the 700-kilometer Chinese-built standard gauge rail between Mombasa and Nairobi. Chinese designers originally promised that the railway would pay for itself, but that has not been the case, leaving the government of Kenya on the hook for the debt. Together with money owed to the World Bank and other multilateral lenders, Kenya's debt will equal 67% of its GDP in 2024. That is according to the National Treasury of Kenya. That's about 50% higher than a decade ago when Kenya signed onto China's Belt and Road Initiative and launched a wave of infrastructure-related borrowing. This development is connected to the recent protest witnessed in Kenya. A story for another day, of course. But now, how has China benefited from Kenya's situation? The construction sector is critical to Kenya's economy, accounting for 5% of the nation's GDP and employing around 1 million people with an annual salary of 3.2 billion shilling, that is Kenyan shilling. The challenge here is, this industry is reportedly controlled by the Chinese. The Chinese government owned a majority of the firms that invest in Kenya. Now, big Kenyan contractors are said to be going out of business as they are unable to compete with deep-pocketed Chinese rivals who have backings from the Communist Party of China. Kenyan construction firms have cited delayed payments by the government as one of the major factors for breaching loan terms, revealing an operational reality that favors Chinese firms. While local firms take loans from local banks at double-digit interest rates, These Chinese rivals have cash reserves besides an option to access subsidized credit from the state-owned China Export and Import Bank. And when you talk of corruption, it's the same story as the other two we looked at. Kenya is perceived as one of the world's most corrupt countries. In August 2018, Reuters reported that 14 officials connected with Kenya's standard gauge rail, that is the $3.2 billion infrastructure project that was financed, built and managed by China, had been arrested over concerns of corruption tied to land acquisition. Ahmed Nasir Abdullahi, a highly respected senior counsel and an outspoken critic of the Kenyan government, said African countries prefer to borrow from China rather than Europe or America because of the kickbacks involved. In 2018, Abdullahi spoke of how China bribes African governments to take their loans. Abdullahi, who is the chairman of the Senior Council Committee, Law Society of Kenya, said that these kickbacks are what makes various countries in Africa prefer the Chinese loans to that of other advanced countries, such as the US and UK. Well, while this might be true, Chinese investors in Africa have rebuffed claims that they offered these bribes first. According to some of the Chinese investors interviewed, they are usually forced to bribe African leaders in order to do business in Africa. And when you move away from Kenya, a similar story could be seen playing out in Cameroon.
Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi said during his visit to Cameroon on Tuesday that China continues to seek win-win cooperation with the West African country.
During its colonial rule in Cameroon, France constructed facilities for the export of cash crops and the import of industrial products into the mainland. As a result, after independence, Cameroon was not capable of separating itself from France economically or politically. To achieve its goal of making the country more autonomous, the first president of the independent republic, Ahmadou Ahidjo, started building relations with major powers at the time, including the United States, Russia, and China. In 1971, Cameroon made its first bold move when it diplomatically recognized the People's Republic of China, a foreign policy tactic aimed at shifting away from the French. This decision would foster a diplomatic and economic relationship that would carry through to Paul Biya's present-day regime. Over the past 2 decades, China has become Cameroon's leading customer, supplier, as well as a leading investor. According to data contained in the 2021 World Investment Report published by the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, the stock of foreign direct investment, FDI, captured by Cameroon between 2000 and 2020 had grown tenfold, mainly thanks to China. Since the first forum on China-Africa cooperation in the year 2000, Beijing has successfully delivered $2.4 billion in development finance to Cameroon. In return for this generous support from China, Cameroon's foreign policy tries to appease the Chinese. For example, President Paul Biya stated in June 2018 that, quote, Cameroon firmly supports the One China policy. But like the other countries mentioned here, the Cameroonian government is beginning to face the realities of dealing with China. Reports have claimed that the country is already failing to meet its debt obligations to China, with President Biya traveling to China several times since November 2017 to plead for Beijing to be more flexible in its debt financing structure. This same story is playing out in Zambia, Sudan, Djibouti, Ghana, Ethiopia, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. But aside the corruption being fueled by Chinese deals in these African countries, there is the violation of labor laws. Chinese companies violate labor laws and workers' rights as governments do nothing to hold them accountable. For years, there have been concerns over Chinese labor practices, often viewed as unfair, with various cases reported of poor and harsh working conditions. China is no doubt the largest developing country in the world. And Africa is, of course, the continent with the largest number of developing countries. Partnership between both Africa and China have seen development come to the continent. But the question is, at what cost? China's Export-Import Bank has financed almost all African governments in diverse degrees. The loans are easily accessible. The Communist Party doesn't pretend to care what the governments do with the monies like the West does, and it helps expand the Chinese market. The Chinese government also doesn't try in so many ways to impose their culture and values on the people of Africa, like America and the others do. So, with just a few agreements and signatures and pictures, the money can start rolling in, or the projects rather. But at what cost?